Okay, so this is going to be a quick start just to get you started on how to use Visual Studio, some of the database tool stuff, and um, how to do some web forms and some ASP.NET. So let's get started here. First topic is the database situation. So when you install Visual Studio 2013, which is I'm running Professional 2013, it comes with a database called LocalDB. So there's so in the kind of the Microsoft world, there's the full SQL Server, and there's a bunch of different versions of that. And then what happened is basically developers kind of needed a version, and a lot of instances there were kind of software developers that were selling your software to companies that didn't want to fully invest in a full SQL Server installation, so they created something called SQL Server Express. And so up until recently, that's what most people would typically run if they were running a develop environment and they needed a version of SQL Server just for their develop environment. Now they have one called LocalDB, which is even smaller than SQL Express. So when you install Visual Studio 2013, the default that it comes with is LocalDB, which is kind of nice. There's some pros and cons to that. One of the pros is that it's just easy to get up and running really quickly. One of the cons is that you can't, well, you can, but it's just a little tougher to manage. So it's typically in a software project, you'll start off with LocalDB for the initial, just getting things up and running, and then at some point in the near future, you'll move either to SQL Server Express, which can take network connections and do all the fancy stuff of a typical database. It has some limitations, and so typically in production, if you have a small application or program that the database is going to stay under, I think they have limits of 10 gigs or something like that, or 1 gig, who knows. But you'd be amazed how much data you can fit when you're just dealing with non-graphical data, when you're just dealing with text and numbers. So real quick, just so like I mentioned, you have LocalDB already installed if you have Professional 2013. However, we're going to get to the point where we need some sort of SQL Server. So if you want to install SQL Server Express, you can do that directly through Microsoft. The full SQL Server should be available through your DreamSpark account. I typically just do the Express initially. I wanted to walk you through, so I just did a Google search. The download page is a little tricky to navigate. Make sure you do 2012 because 2014 really isn't compatible with Visual Studio 2013 yet. It's got issues, so make sure you do 2012, and the 2012 download page is pretty bad. So you click download and you get all these weird file names. So let's just scroll down to x86, that way you don't have to worry about if you're 32 or 64-bit. It doesn't matter anyway because of what you're doing. It's not going to use more than 4 gigs of memory. So so here's LocalDB, which you already have as a part of your Visual Studio 2013 installation. This one's pretty important, so you might want to download this one. This is the Management Studio, and here is the actual SQL Server Express database. The RDBMS is what they call it, Relational Database Management Server. And so there's kind of a difference. One's the actual one that holds the database and does all the management of it. This one's kind of a user interface on top of all that. So I can bring that up real quick. Here we go. And we'll just connect to LocalDB, which I think is running. What's nice is that LocalDB, yeah, okay, so it should list all our database. Visual Studio knows how to start and stop that and take care of all that. So we see a bunch of databases. We'll find out what these are later, but when you create a web application through Visual Studio, it automatically creates a LocalDB database for you. So a lot of that's already taken care of, just so you can it's just more for quick start purposes. You don't have to spend a lot of time setting up databases and getting all kinds of stuff working. You get a basic application running, and then from there you can bring over your tables to another version of SQL Server. So close that out. So let's actually get into So that's just for the future, because those downloads take a little bit, and just so you know the tools. But right now we'll just be working with Visual Studio Professional 2013. So first thing, we're going to be working with web forms. Web forms are the easiest to work with. There's another style called MVC, just so you are aware of it. We won't be working with that for this project, because web forms are, especially if you're not really a programmer and you don't program very much, web forms are going to be a lot easier to deal with than MVC. So just if you see it, know it's kind of similar to web forms and it serves a similar purpose, but it's kind of different. So let's go to New, File, New, and then Project. And then we'll do under Templates, we'll do it all these in C#, and then click Web, and then then do this. Make sure you don't click into here, because it gives you, if you do it under this template, you get some extra menu choices after this that we want to use. Doesn't really matter what we call it. We'll this is just for testing. This isn't going to be a real one. We're not using source control yet. We probably will very soon, because as people start to share all this stuff, once we get servers and stuff set up, we'll use source control, because that's really important. Even for small projects, I pretty much always use source control, just because it's really easy to set up, and there's so many benefits to it. Okay, so we click, we want web forms. As I mentioned, see, we have MVC here, and there's some other options. So web forms, our box is already checked. We're not going to be doing unit tests, but it's a good thing to look up what those are, because they're very important. There's a whole field of development called unit test-driven development, and basically you write a tiny piece of code, write a test for it, and then move on. And then when you're done with the software, you just run all these unit tests, and you can pretty much test the whole software without having to have people interact with you. And it actually works pretty good with this MVC, but we're not going to be using it, so don't worry about it. We're not hosting in the cloud. Make sure the authentication is set to individual user accounts. We'll be using the built-in ASP .NET authentication, and it has some kind of cool stuff that we can do with it later that they've added in recent versions. They have what's known as two-factor authentication, so that might be something that we consider using later. And they also have what's known as OAuth and OAuth 2, and so that's when you click login through Twitter or login through Facebook or login through Google+. Those use OAuth and OAuth 2, and Twitter's the one who actually kind of originally came up with it, and it's basically a way that you can use external authentication. You kind of just pass these what's known as tokens around. So these are the settings we have. We click OK. Okay, so we've got and you can see in our Solution Explorer, it set up our web application project under this solution. Don't really worry about what the differences are. Sometimes what you'll do is have just multiple parts to your whole large project, you could call, that you're working on. Solution is kind of top level, so you can have like 5 or 6 projects within a single solution. You can have different languages, and so, but we're just going to have one solution, one project. So just that's when you see these two things, that's what they are. Okay, so first thing, yours probably looks like this. I typically, one of the first things I do, especially because I'm on a widescreen monitor, I pin this so it doesn't auto hide. So I've got my toolbox and the Server Explorer tabs. So you can see under data connections, we have no data connections. That's the first thing to note. The way a lot of these, what's known as an ORM, which is an object relational mapper, will do a lot of database generation and management for you. And so all this ASP.NET stuff has kind of ORM-like capability built in. We're not going to use a true ORM. If you're interested, it's called Entity Framework is their ORM. And then you do queries with something called link. And so we're not going to use that, but it gives us some of that functionality, and some of that is automatic database creation and management, and that way we can kind of flip between databases really easy. We can upgrade field names and column names and all these other cool things. But so let's just do a quick start. So you can see it actually created a lot of stuff automatically for you. And so a lot of these pages are only kind of half working, and so we have to finish them. But let's just click register, and then we'll open this page and we'll actually see how it, the first time this code runs, it sees that the database doesn't exist and certain tables don't exist, so it automatically creates them. Okay, so one of the things I typically like to do, so I have this register. Let me double click it. Register.aspx page open. You can see all the HTML. Some of you probably have limited HTML knowledge, so you probably want to go into split mode, and then you can kind of see a rough preview of the page. So let's just go ahead and click the play button here. And then what it does is it has a built-in web server and it runs it on some odd port. That way there's no conflicts. And we're actually connected to our program right now. So let's do a test registration. And then these default password rules they have set are really strict. So let me create a password here that'll, let me click register. Okay, no, I don't want to save this. It's not a real password. Okay, so it logged us in, and that's all well and good. So now we go back to Visual Studio, and let's go ahead and stop debugging. And then all of a sudden we can see magically we've got a default connection, and so we click that, and within that connection it actually created a bunch of tables. So we see our users it automatically created, since that was a registration screen. All this other stuff with roles, we're not going to worry about it too much right now, but one of the nice things is it created us a default database. And if we hop over to, well, I don't want to take up too much time, that takes a little bit to open, but basically the database name it creates is your application name plus some randomness after that. But if you're looking for it in Management Studio, and then once it's created, you can migrate it over. One of the things to note is when you're doing that migration, it's a really simple process. Basically, you just change this. Oh, I'm in the wrong web.config. So I'm going to close the account folder. I'm going to go to the root web config. And you can see there's a section for, and see, as I mentioned earlier, here's Entity Framework, but we're actually going to go to connection strings, and it created the name default connection and some string. You can see local DB as opposed to, and then so this is the instance name. So we can see the name of our database here. So it created local DB, just uses flat files that used an MDF file. And so we can see web application 5. We didn't give it a super fancy name, but basically once we have a real SQL Server set up, we set up a DNS name or IP address or whatever, and so connection strings aren't that difficult to create, and there's tutorials how to do that. It takes about 30 seconds to create a new connection string. You just bring the tables over, so that's not that big of a deal. But this web.config, this has a lot of application configuration stuff, so you'll probably have this open every once in a while, and a lot of this stuff you can't do through a GUI, so you just have to kind of know a little bit of XML. You won't typically have to add things, you usually just change things. So if you know your new connection string, you go in here and you fill all this stuff out. Okay, so we've got our registration page, so we've got a database created, so we've got a working web application, but it doesn't do anything that we want it to do yet. So let's close all this extra stuff. Let's pretend we're creating a shopping cart. And so we'll start to make our own tables, and let's just do this through Visual Studio initially. Doesn't really matter what you do it through, because essentially you can dump this all out to an SQL create table file and have all this. You can pass that pretty much to anything. So first thing let's database naming conventions. So Google this. I don't really care one way or the other about naming conventions, as long as they're consistent. Some people have things that they really love and will get really upset if you don't do it their certain way. Doesn't really matter to me. I think as long as everybody's using the same naming convention, it just makes it a lot easier to read. That's the whole reason for a naming convention in the first place. This first one looks good enough. So they do table names are singular, all lowercase. So user, permission, and then they do camel case if it's multi-word. I'm sorry, that's general conventions. Let me go to table conventions. That looks more like what I'm used to. Okay, so table conventions, all lowercase, multi-word is separated by an underscore, and it's singular. Some people like to do plural table names. It doesn't really matter to me, but so we'll stick to these for now, just so that way that it's easier to, that way you can, if you can reference a document and say, I don't know how to name this, well, just go to this, and we've got some naming conventions. The other important thing is column conventions. We'll get into indexes and foreign keys and all this other stuff later, but right now just table and column. So table single, singular with an underscore in between, and then column is lowercase, and then this is what's known as camel case. So this is known as snake case, and this is known as camel case, and the reason is because it kind of looks like a snake. You know how they curl up with their back and there's a hump, and then this is like the peaks and valleys, so that's the name, and this is supposed to look like a camel's hump. I don't know how much these things actually look like snakes and camels, but that's just the terminology that people use. So okay, so we're going to create a products table. So it'll be named product, singular, all lowercase. So let's go to table, add new table, and then it brings up our little, so I'm just going to edit directly in here while that's loading. Okay, so product, and then so we've got our table name, and then I'll add the fields in here. So is there actually, you know what you can do, let's use the tools that are available here. We can change the name from table. Let's change it in here to product. Will it automatically? No, that won't let us edit. So I guess we do have to edit in here. There might be another way. This is just the quickest for me right now without having to look any stuff up. Okay. So we've got a product ID. So let's go to our naming conventions. We're going to do the table name, so product, and then in camel case, IDs in cap. So we will change this guy to product ID, just like that, and it'll be an integer. We don't want nulls, and so that's going to be our primary key. That's fine. Let's make sure we match the column convention. So product ID. Yep, we match them. So now with this clicked, let's go to its properties. Identity specification is an identity, and we're going to auto increment by 1, and we're going to seed it to 1. So basically what that'll do is product ID starts at 1 and it increments through. That's a very popular style, and we'll use that because it makes for nice URLs. So if you see a URL on a site, sometimes you'll see like especially blogs, you'll see like blogspot.com/username/ and then some number like 5. That will be the blog entry ID. There's another style. There's things called GUIDs, and they're supposed to be globally unique. Some people prefer that, but it's actually a 64-bit identifier, and so it's really, and we'll Google that real quick so you can see what a GUID looks like. They look like this, and they're very long, and so imagine going to a web page and you see something like that. So let's paste that into the, just kind of looks bad. People like to see, they like to see URLs like that, you know. They don't like to see, but it gets, this is important just to know. Sometimes in business applications you do want that because you get a level of uniqueness. That way if you're passing databases around, because there's a lot on database there, you have a natural key and a surrogate key, and these GUIDs they're still surrogate keys, but it because they're globally unique, you can kind of pass around tables and dump them and bring them into other databases easily. So don't worry about that too much. Just be aware if you see that somewhere sometime. But so we'll stick with this identity incrementing by 1. Start at 1. Okay, so let's just do some really generic field names. Let's do making sure we stick with our conventions. Let's we'll have a name, and that name will be so something to note real quick if anybody doesn't know this. So when we see the N in front of character data type, then that means it's going to be, okay, so when you just see char 10 like that, or char, depending, I've heard people say both ways. I say char, short for character. That's just going to be 8 bits wide, and that's not going to be able to handle what's known as I18N or Unicode. So when you're doing internationalization stuff, we're not too concerned about internationalization. This N in front of it means that it can handle Unicode, which is going to be able to do wider character encoding than just 8 bits. It can do 8, 16, 32. We're not really concerned about that, so maybe we'll be one day, but it's just a little easier to work with. So we'll do a varchar. Let's say the name 50 is a good default. Because the way these work, and if you're not aware, basically what happens is if you don't use all 50, say you use 10, if the varying character part, so if you just did this and you just put in 10 characters, it stores as internally in the database, it uses all 50. If you do a character varying, basically it stores the last, so say we store 10 characters, it actually stores 11. So it stores 10 plus basically a terminating character. It's known as the null byte, N-U-L-L. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind. So that's the difference between just char 50 and varchar 50 typically, unless you have a reason that you know it's going to be a certain width. So say, for example, states, and you abbreviated it to 2 letters, you know it's always going to be 2 letters. So that's a case that you'd want to use char instead of varchar. In this case, we don't know really how long the name's going to be. It could be up to 50, but sometimes it could be really short, sometimes it could be really long. We want to give them the option of having a long name, so we won't allow nulls. That's good enough for that one. Let's say a description. And then we'll do that one as a generic text, because that might get pretty long. So we won't allow nulls. Let's get some other. Let's say the stock is going to be an integer. That's how many are in stock. There might be a better name for that, but let's say the default is 0. And then let's come up with a Boolean so we can see some of the features as auto generation stuff. So we'll say is available. And I think they do it as a bit. I don't think there's a bool type. I think this is it. We'll try it. We'll see how it works. And then by default, it's false. That way we don't see our product as being available right away. Okay. Oop, we don't want to save that. We're just going to, and let's make sure we stuck with our naming conventions. So one of the convention is do this, Boolean values. We see is active, and did I actually call it? Let's say is active. That's a better name. Is active. Okay. So we've stuck with our naming conventions. Okay, we've got some defaults. We've got everything we need. Okay, we don't really need to save it. We'll just run it. So we click update. And then we're just going to directly update to the database, and it runs through pretty quickly. We can see down here, update completed successfully. So we've got a product table. Now let's connect some code with it. So if we click refresh, we see it's there, but there's going to be nothing in it. So if we show table data, it's just going to be blank. Yep, so it's blank. Okay, let's click our web application here, and first thing let's do is create a new, nope, that's not where we want to do it. We want to do it right here. It's going to be add new item. So add new item. And then we'll talk about master pages in a little bit, but we're going to do web form with master page. Doesn't really matter. We can just leave it. This is just going to be a test. Typically, you want to give these real names. Doesn't really matter. Well, let's give it a real name. Let's call this one product. Okay, so it's going to be from master page, and then let you choose the master page. Depending if we're doing a mobile site or not, which we're not, we'll just leave it as this. So that'll be fine. Okay, so let's switch back over to split view, and you can see there's really nothing there. First thing that we want to do is we want to hop over to our toolbox tab. So we were in a server explorer, hop over to our toolbox, and just in case you forgot, your Visual Studio may look like that. I typically pin it so it doesn't go away. Okay, so first thing we want to do is go to our data right here, and then we want to click and drag over a SQL data source. Okay, and you can see it put the ASP code. So one of the things that you'll notice is it's prefixed by this ASP and then a colon. When you see this, this means that it is ASP specific code. It's not HTML. So like a typical tag in HTML might look like something like that. And that's some HTML5. That's the article tag. We know that because it has the ASP in front, it's ASP specific code. And then one of the things you'll also notice is this run at server. That means it's run on the back end and not on the front end. So you can do, there's situations where you do both, and when you have it running on the front end, typically it translates it into some sort of JavaScript that runs. But so keep that in mind. If you're looking at something and it says run at server, you know it's running on the back end. So SQL data source 1, that's fine. Typically we'll give it a better name, but like product data source, and let's do that. Let's give these some good names. Product, well, this is some other naming conventions. The reason Microsoft does this is because their naming conventions is you have the data type first, and then so sometimes you'll see like txt and then some name. There's a name for that naming convention. We'll just kind of sort of stick with what they're giving us. So SQL data source product. Okay, so we see our SQL data source. Now we configure it, and it created that default connection when we did that registration. So we click next. We want to pick our table. We're going to be using our product table, and just click the star because that way it generates everything for us. We're not going to be using aware, but this is where you'd kind of build the query, and then we click advanced, and then we want to generate, insert, update, and delete, and then use this. I won't go into this too much. This is basically a way of sort of locking. So if somebody opens a page and modifies a record, from that time between they open the page and click submit, somebody else could have modified the record. So that's what this essentially does, is it detects whether the database has changed since the record has been loaded. So on some non-web applications, what they used to do is actually lock the table, and there's different ways of locking. You can lock the whole table, you can just lock the row. In web applications, that's typically not really an option, because a lot of times people open the page and abandon the page, and then you get with these kind of locks that are stuck. So this kind of helps out with that. So generate, insert, update, delete, use optimistic concurrency, and I think that should be good enough for that one. We can test. Nothing's going to return. Just make sure our database is running, I guess. Okay, click finish. So now we have a data source. Okay. Next thing we want to do typically is add a form view. And so these data, before I move on, I should note. So before we didn't really have that much ASP code, and it generated all kinds of stuff. So, and you can always do these by hand. You don't need these wizards, and that's what's sort of nice about the new versions of Visual Studio, is it generates XML style code. The old versions used to use like code that you couldn't modify or do anything with, and now it actually generates code, and you can modify it. And the old style was it was like a no-no to ever modify generated code, but with Visual Studio you can actually modify this generated code. So one of the things, so remember we said generate our insert, update, and delete, and so when we say insert command equals, and it actually generated a table insert, and you can see these @ signs, these are parameters. I lost it, but yeah, anything with these @ signs in front are parameters, and we'll and then you can see it matches up to here where it says parameter names. So you can scroll through that and look in Google as needed, but that's what that is. So the next thing we want to do is add a form view. So that just created our data source for this page. Now we want to add a form view, and we want to so I clicked and dragged it on to our page, and we want to connect it to our data source. And sometimes I click refresh. It looks like it automatically did it. Let me click refresh just to make sure, because I've had some issues with that in the past. Okay, so we've actually got all this code that it generated. So there's our data source, and I actually put the form above it. So we've got our edit template. So this is when we click to edit a page. Say we're a merchant and we want to edit our product, and then we go to that products page and we can edit it. This is insert when we're creating a new one. This is when you're just viewing item template, and so you can modify these through code, or if you click on the actual form view, you can edit templates, and then it shows all the available ones. And so initially we'll start off an insert, and if you wanted to change this button style or whatever, there's a lot of different things you can do with it. We'll leave the basic generated one for now, but you'll probably end up having to do that for this project. So we'll end editing, and I think that's good enough. So one of the things we have to do is it has these different modes. So these are what's known as attributes. They're kind of a key value pair. So we have data source ID equals, and if we go down here to these properties are actually these match 1 to 1. So what we can do is, just so you're kind of aware of it, let's find one here. We need to set the default mode. Okay. So default mode, we want to set it to insert. And so we can see how it generated here. It set it to insert. So right here under this property, this will typically just have all the defaults, and then as soon as you add something, it actually puts it in the XML code. And this XML code is what's actually executed. So I think we have enough to run a test. So we have our page, we click Chrome. Okay, so let's give it, we'll say we're selling beans, and beans are I think that's how you spell it, maybe, I don't know. So, and then we'll say that we've got 1,000 in stock, and then we'll check this checkbox. So you can see that the text and numeric type fields automatically did an input type of text in HTML, but it knew to do a checkbox. So that's kind of interesting, because remember we had is active, so that's kind of one of the neat things with this. We can also, if we have our table relations set up correctly, we can also automatically have these have drop-down menus created. So it's pretty much the same process. You just have to have all your foreign keys set up beforehand. Okay, so we're going to click insert, and nothing really happened. It just kind of disappeared. It did insert to the database, so we will stop debugging, and let's hop over to our Server Explorer. Go back in our database, go to tables, product, and let's just view all the records, show table data. And we can see our first product ID was inserted, so that's good. But what we want to do now is say let's pretend we're doing our use cases, and we're a merchant, and we're on our page to edit and do everything with our products. What we'll typically do is add some sort of, it's called a grid view, and it lists all the products available or whatever. You can edit the query, and you can add where clauses in the most recent 50 products. You can do all that. So typical query stuff. So if you go back to Toolbox, what we're going to, and it'll make sense once you see it, it's called a grid view. So you click, drop it onto your SQL data source, and then just like before, it gives us a bunch of stuff. So the two you'll be bouncing back and forth constantly is form views and grid views. And then so the kind of life cycle of the page is creating a SQL data source. You might create multiple sources depending on the page, but a lot of times you just create one, and then you add some sort of form view, and then sometimes grid view. Sometimes a page will only have a form view, sometimes a page will only have a grid view. So for example, a page that only has a grid view is a search page. So you search, you give it some parameters, and you can pass those parameters to the query, and then you just return a grid. There's no real reason to have a form on that page. New user registration is an example of a page that you'd have a form but no grid. In this example, we're going to actually have both. So let's choose our data source. And this one pretty much sets itself up. Paging is basically, so we say we limit to each grid response to 10 records. Paging will allow us to click next and take care of all that. It takes care of a lot of nice things for us. Sorting is kind of nice. You can actually do in-place editing. I don't care for it because it makes it kind of look like an Access app, and I think that the reason Microsoft did that is to match the grid view and other .NET and Access style stuff. I don't really care for it because typically what you want to do is click it and then get it into a details view or form view, depending. So Deletion, we'll leave that unchecked, and then we'll leave that unchecked. So we should be good to actually run our page again here. So let's click it. Left our old one open. Okay, so we see, and then so if you added new product, now let's add some carrots. I'll say carrots are good on salads and with some ranch. Okay, and we'll say nobody likes carrots. So we've got a bunch in stock. We've got 50,000. We'll say it's active, and then we insert. So when we click insert, we just have this so far. When we click insert, what'll happen is auto incremented the product ID, and then we have our other fields here. So you can kind of see how this stuff starts to work together and actually make a new database driven app from web pages. So I'm about to almost hit 37 minutes. I'll kind of wrap it up. We'll talk about security another time because that gets really complicated really quick, but this should be enough to just sort of get you started here. Let me take you through one more thing. So say we don't want to show the product ID. That's internal. That's just hidden. We don't really want to show them that. What we can start to do is start to edit these things. So let's go back here and let's click it and let's click edit. And then so we want to edit templates, and then this one's kind of interesting because if no data comes back, you can create a custom message that says no records returned or whatever. But we're actually what we'll do is just to save time and to kind of show you the XML. So we're in the grid view columns. You can see right here it has all our fields. So say product ID. So we could change the header text. We could say if it's read only. And I think all these are, yeah, typically that primary key is going to, especially if it's a surrogate key, it's not going to be editable. So but let's just take this whole thing out. We just don't even want to view it. So now we can see it's gone, and then let's one more time click Chrome. And then we can see it disappeared. So hopefully that makes, oh, let me take you through one last thing that we have time for. This should only be a couple minutes. So one of the things we mentioned was the master page. This is just basically a template page, and some other web frameworks are fancier on how they can handle templates. This one's pretty simple. So say we have on the top corner here, we have application name. So if we wanted to start changing this around, it makes it so that all we have to do is just change this one, and every page that uses it is automatically, and this is done at runtime every single time. So you don't have to click all kinds of update buttons and regenerate forms and child templates and everything. It's done at runtime automatically. So we want to change the application name to my IRSC program, and then we click play. Oh, and actually we didn't want to do that. Give me 1 second. Let me close some of these. One thing to note is when you click that play button, it's going to bring up whatever page you're on. So since I clicked site.master, it tried to bring up the site master. That's not really an active page. That's kind of a page that is provided for other pages. So I'm not sure what it even would bring up. But we want to bring up an ASPX page. And you can see it change it to my IRSC program. So we're about to hit 40 minutes. That should be good enough to get you started and start to think about how to actually work with these tools and everything.